Welcome to New Thinking for a New World, a Telberg Foundation podcast. I am Alan Stoga, your host. Each week, I bring you conversations with people who think differently about the great issues that are shaping our world. Geopolitics, disruptive tech, mass migration, the changing climate, culture wars, all of it is grist for our mill. I hope you enjoy listening. I also hope you will let me know what you think and that you join the conversation at telbergfoundation.org. And now for today's episode of New Thinking for a New World. The summer of 2023 might be remembered as the year that people almost everywhere finally began to understand what global warming means in fact, not in theory. Unrelenting record heat, widespread drought, massive wildfires, water shortages, matched by excessive rains elsewhere, followed by destructive 100-year floods, these have become the new normal. Anyone who is surprised simply hasn't been paying attention. The science and the modeling have been clear and pretty accurate, at least since the 70s. But like the proverbial frogs in the slowly heating water, we've been content to ignore the evidence. The obvious question is whether it's now too late to reverse all this, at least within the kind of timescale that matters to people alive today. That question is usually answered by dreamy scientists who are working on their version of the Big Bang. We're going to try something different today by asking it of Paula DiPerna, a policy expert and author who has spent decades thinking about how to solve the climate crisis. Paula has just published a book, Pricing the Priceless, that essentially argues the answer is, well, obvious. Paula, welcome to New Thinking for a New World.
Thank you, Alan. A pleasure to be here.
I want to start with a question that you ask in your book, and I quote, "Why do our capital markets value companies like Uber, which offer services we can live without at billions of dollars, but our atmosphere on which all life depends at zero? And isn't that the core of the problem?"
To me, it's the core of the problem, and the answer is the core of the solution. Because, I think we've seen that, raw material, of course, is an input, but if you go beyond what you need for input at no price or low price, you're going to get what we have, which is, an undervaluation. And something like Uber, not to pick on them, but what came to me is one day when Uber was brand new and people were excited, they had booked me an Uber, and did I want to watch the car on their phone getting closer and closer? And I thought, I don't know why that's so exciting. It's just a taxi service with a different name, And I just looked up the market cap of Uber and found out it was higher that day than General Motors. So Uber drives cars. General Motors makes them, but Uber's market cap was higher. And so that kind of triggered the thinking of, well, how does that happen? And of course, I know capital valuation is somewhat in the eye of the beholder and the investor. But until we switch this and start looking at that very remote and very limited atmospheric space, which is 60 miles of supply of space that's all very much crowded, valuing it practically at zero, until we flip this idea and figure out how to put market cap, so to speak, into the atmosphere so that we respect its value, we're going to be behind the eight ball in addressing climate change, because, as you pointed out, the impacts of these extremes are very costly, and we don't seem to have the cash up front to really get at it.
But that begs the question whether, in fact, it's possible to get at it, first. Second, whether it can be done in the ways that we clearly are failing. We're trying lots of things, but they're all failing, at least as measured by what you and I see as we look out our windows. Clearly, the climate in the summer of 2023 isn't particularly pleasant in most places of the world. So you are certainly right that, and I was trained as an economist, if it's free, you abuse it. That's almost a basic principle of economics. Yet we continue to abuse it. Our planet.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, that's going to continue. I mean, you mentioned the wildfires. So, what turned me on about writing this book, apart from it was truly a personal exploration because I was not trained as an economist and not trained in finance. And so it was an exploration and a kind of a peeling of the onion for me. And I went around the world looking for examples to bear out my thesis that if we shifted, and it isn't just my thesis, my job was to synthesize thinking that has been going on what you could call ecosystem services and bringing the externalities that have been outside of the bookkeeping system, namely environmental services, into accounting and how to do that. And as you know, economists have been squabbling and reckoning with that for decades. So I came upon, for example, this forest resilience bond, which is something we can do in our lifetime and is proving itself to be quite successful. And what does that do? And that was the brainchild of 4 very young Haas business school students out in Berkeley. And their insight was that a resilient forest, by which I mean a forest that's healthy, that has resistance to wildfire, that is not diseased, that is not crowded, that is relatively moist, that there are beneficiaries to that forest, and you could tote up and you can count up the value of those benefits across the very disparate set of beneficiaries. And the set of beneficiaries of a resilient forest are kind of disparate and interesting. So obviously you think of, the rest of us who like the idea of forests, but what about the hydropower company that is trying to keep water literally going over its dam and feeder streams and feeder rivers to those reservoirs draw from the water table, and water table, if it's too dry, less water over the dam. The hydropower has to buy power from another source. So that's a cost that you can figure out. Then you have the tourism operators who benefit from the forest being resilient by being able to promote tourism products that take people into the forest. And you don't want to promote a product into a forest that could sort of catch fire at any moment. Then you have the public service budgets that are stretched because their budgets to prevent forest fires and maintain the forest for resiliency are stretched because that money is going to put out fires because there's such an increase in wildfire, California being the poster example of that. So the resilience bond takes all those beneficiaries, puts them in a room, totes up the benefits, and then goes to the private market and says, do you want to invest in these benefits? If you do, you'll get a premium from these beneficiaries who'll pay you back over time. And so the money comes in from capital markets, and in that case, also foundations at the pilot stage, and the money goes right into forest maintenance, as opposed to the money not being there for forest maintenance. So money in upfront, risk borne by the investors, forest made more resilient, benefits later. And you can actually put a value on that via the benefits, and it transfers into a financial instrument. And the people who set that up the first one was a $4 million bond, and now they have 2 $25 million offerings and a potential infrastructure portfolio that's set up just the way you fund infrastructure. It's the same investment idea.
It's a wonderful example. It's all important, but with all due respect, it's tiny, almost trivial compared to the magnitude of the problem and the time scale of the problem. And that's really the point. I was reading a JP Morgan report this morning about their effort to look at the next 20 years or so. And they made the obvious point, but it's what you've been saying, that the only way to convince the world to dramatically cut carbon emissions is to put a seriously high price on carbon. The little problem with that is that it's not new news, and various countries have been thinking about it. Some of them even doing it today. Something like 20% or so of global greenhouse gas emissions are covered by government efforts to try to price carbon. But that's only 20%. at a world where we are at, I repeat, 420 ppm, where we are clearly about to blow through 1.5 degrees warming, etc. So we have, as you've just outlined with the forest restoration bond, and there are other examples, and you cite them in the book. Terrific example is a very innovative work being done that is important work. But does it match the scale and the urgency of the problem?
Yeah. Well, no, that's the issue. And I mean, I guess what I'd say is it's trivial now, but what would prevent the Prime Minister of Canada from going to the financial markets based on the proven example of the California experiment and say, I want to issue a bond or bonds that covers the whole forest structure, the whole forest cover, and it covers Canada.
Why it's a rhetorical question, but it's an important one because he hasn't done so. And he's an environmentalist.
Okay, but I'd love to get a meeting with him and put the question there. But also, to your point, and you've always talked about this, Alan, is, the distinction between big ideas and executing big ideas. I feel just as a practical matter, we've almost got no appetite left for big ideas. Big ideas are, AI. Big ideas are not, the big idea would be to do a forest bond for the whole entire country of Canada or the entire state of California. There's nothing preventing that except doing it.
That's exactly my question. Something is preventing these things from happening because they're not happening. There's a wonderful quote in your book from Charles Keeling, who did amazing chemistry work back in the 50s, as you know, because you write about it, and did the first estimates of the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the quote is this: if the human race survives into the 21st century, the people living then, us today now, may face the threat of climate change brought about by uncontrolled increase of atmospheric CO2 from fossil fuels. This is a man writing in the 50s. But he was optimistic that his students in the 50s would be the first generation, and you quote this, it's fascinating, to feel such strong concern for man's future that they will discover means of effective action. That is 75 years ago. Why didn't they?
Well, I mean, a simple one thing is you kick the can, and I'd love your views on this. So I don't know if you play slot machines, but as you know, when, the jackpot is cherries all across or bananas all across. Now, I don't play them either, but I know that much. And so if you think about three wheels, I think one of the reasons we haven't done much or done enough quickly enough is because of the proverbial siloization, but not everything, just three things: science, policy, and capital. So science has run Keeling curve ran on a scientific timeline that was very much the scientific method. Research comes in, it gets put into the public domain at its own pace, and it almost never is seen in time by policymakers who run behind the science.
Just stay there 1 second, because I don't want to let politicians off the hook. In 1977, Jimmy Carter was president. He was handed a memo from his chief science advisor, which in 2 pages exactly summarized what Keeling was talking about and said, we are at an existential point where if we make changes now, we can do something about this. He chose not to. He sent it on to Jim Schlesinger, Secretary of Energy, who said, we don't know enough. Let's wait. So the politicians, it's not lack of knowledge. It's something else. There's something else. And I want to get to the other two the bananas in your metaphor. But there's something about politician, whether it's our Canadian environmentalist who hasn't done anything, whether it's Jimmy Carter back in the 70s, whether it's all of the other people globally, we are where we are. What is it about policymakers that they failed us?
Well, they definitely have. I mean, again, back to the big ideas, but, you go out on a limb, you need the people with you. Just putting aside everything in the book, I think one big failure on the part of the environmental movement, in which I consider myself to be one, and I'm not personally a philanthropist, but I ran a foundation. It was very, very, very difficult to get environmental movement and environmentalists to think about the jobs implications of shifting from fossil fuels. Instead of promoting that shift as a reindustrialization, a reemployment program, putting public need to be secure in their economic futures first. We didn't, or they didn't. And so political will didn't build. It's one thing to have concern, but as you know, concern and fear are not motivators. And so if you're a politician, and not to get them off the hook, but even Jimmy Carter, poor guy, put a sweater on and he was vilified for telling you to turn the thermostat down. And, he may have passed that on to Schlesinger, but he also did try to, promote nuclear power. He tried, even Ronald Reagan. I mean, everybody knew about this. Everybody, 6 presidents knew about it. They all kicked the can. And I believe it's because, one, they knew about it, but it was tomorrow. Secondly, the public wasn't clamoring for it. And third, it's just this inertia of a political system that gets heavier and heavier and heavier. And you need courageous people. You need breakthrough people. It's a cliche, but you need somebody to say what John Kennedy said: in 10 years, we're putting a man on the moon, full stop.
Yes, but that's just the United States. In no country anywhere on the planet has there been sustained movement to a non-carbon-based economy. It's not just American failure, it's global failure.
It's a global failure. But again, so back to the bananas, allowing for the politicians sneaking.
Okay, that's one banana. Second banana.
So science is running on its timeline. Even good policy, even good, wishful, hopeful policy runs on a political timeline, which is at least the electoral calendars in whatever the location. And then capital.
In democracies.
Well, let's say we're only talking about democracies for now.
But we can't. We have to talk about the globe, because if the democracies can't solve this problem, that's the real challenge. And you pointed out in the book, it's a global challenge.
Right.
It's not just an American challenge or European challenge or an Indian challenge.
True. But I mean, if you want, again, do the doable, leave China for the moment out. But, I'm a big believer in doability. So, and meanwhile, the third banana, capital, which operates on all kinds of timelines, as short as a quarterly returns call, as long as an intergenerational portfolio transfer from a grandfather to a niece or a granddaughter, So the three things have not aligned. And what needs to happen, and that's, what needs to happen, and what I try to say in the book, is we have to align the scientific information with the application of capital, made certain, as companies, investors, regulatory certainty they like. There is no regulatory certainty and there's no standardization. So back to the carbon price, you have a pretty functional EU ETS, which is like putting up an umbrella.
ETS means what for our listeners?
Okay, so you have a functioning cap and trade system in the European Union called the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, which scheme is a schemy word and probably shouldn't be used, but it is the name of it. And if you think of, you think about the global case. So let's say it's raining everywhere on Earth on the same day, and I put up an umbrella in Cooperstown and stand under it. It's true, I'm dry. The rest of the world is wet. And the same is true of this EU ETS. It's put up an umbrella and capped emissions over the European Union, but the emissions are going up outside of the European Union. California has put a cap. Emissions in theory should be going down in California. The rest of the states, it's not.
But they're not. Importantly, they're not, because it's not much of a cap.
It's not much of a cap. RGGI, even less of a cap. But you do have the structures that if they could be linked and standardized, here's another moonshot, link California and RGGI. Then you have an indicative national carbon price de facto. Then you link RGGI in California to the EU ETS. Then you start to have a global carbon price de facto. So, if I were queen, I would take the Article 6 negotiations and speed them up and say, okay, you want the rule book, cross-border adjustment, all this is good, but tomorrow we're trading carbon. Here's the standard. Here's the price. Let's see what happens.
Now let's follow that up, because that is, I think, precisely an important part of the problem, which is leadership and agency. I would argue, as a premise, there has been almost no leadership on the issue to speak of. We've had, and we'll have yet another UN meeting in Doha later this year. Anything that has a 28 or a 38 or a 48 after its name is either a dead pope, in my judgment, or a pretty dead process. So where is the leadership going to come from? Because with all due respect, they're not going to make you queen and they're not going to make me king. And so we can't do it.
Well, I did speak to the Pope. No, you're right. The leadership is going to come from, individuals stepping out. So, it may be back to the Canada example. I don't know who's going to hear this podcast, but, why wouldn't Jamie Dimon go and talk to the Prime Minister of Canada and propose this? Maybe I should call Jamie Dimon.
But let's talk about that, because Jamie Dimon certainly knows how to do a forced restoration bond. It's not an issue.
But it hasn't occurred to him.
Why? Except 23% of global emissions are already covered by some kind of scheme. It's not new technology. It's tried and true technology. It just isn't applied technology.
But these financial instruments are still fairly new. The coral reef insurance, fairly new. So it could be just an informational problem. I mean, I take your point. Without a carbon price, none of the more exotic things are going to get anywhere.
Thanks for listening so far. I hope you're enjoying the conversation as much as I have. If you haven't already, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and rate us on Apple Podcast. Now back to today's discussion, sponsored by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, SNF.
You, in the book, and appropriately, because it is quite obviously true, at least if you believe in pricing, until carbon is expensive, we will live in a hydrocarbon world. You either have to ban it or tax it, or it won't go away. We've seen that now. It's pretty obvious. The question is, will this bubble up from below? Will it be imposed from above? And will either of those two processes happen fast enough to actually save people? 62,000 people died in Europe last year from heat-related causes during the summer.
Well, we have to accelerate. I mean, Sylvia Earle, and about her hope spots, right? And her approach to protecting the whole ocean is to find these places that you can still put off limits and then gradually link them up. And she calls them hope spots. If we're talking carbon pricing, I think maybe the same needs to be done. You take the EU ETS. I mean, it's easy for me to say. If I could go around and seed all these people and just get an appointment and say, why don't you do this and that? Not that they would listen to me, but basically doability. People don't do things because they're afraid they're not doable. All you have to do is a lot of demonstrations. And I go back, maybe it's the crass carbon traders. Maybe it's the people who are buying carbon. Maybe they start a platform, ICE. Maybe I should go and talk to ICE or some of the big commodities markets and say, why don't you just link up? Why don't you find a way to make a demo trade tomorrow? All these things I think can be done. It's a question of people's, imagination. Absence of imagination is an extremely important factor in why we're stuck with this problem. Very little imagination. Secondly is the political structure and the dependence on fossil fuel. There's really no easy alternative. I just was found out something yesterday I was working on, reviewing somebody's proposal to put solar panels in the Southwest on Navajo land. And I found out the extraordinary number of people who live in Navajo reservations without power at all, when they're off the grid without wanting to be. It's not like they're, back to the woods people, and have been 2 generations or 3 without power. And with a little package of solar array, you can power their entire house. And why isn't that being done with all the money that's going to Infrastructure Reduction Act and so on? Why aren't we massively massively, put an army of people out there putting solar arrays on and figuring out how to get the money back from the people or even just giving it to them. There's so many solutions that are available that we're not doing for an absence, as we've said, political will, but also doability. Everything has become so cosmically big that people don't get started. And I go back also to COVID, back to human nature. COVID broke a lot of momentum. It broke a lot of, and COVID is the only, and I mentioned this in the book, it's the only time emissions have gone down in any significant way.
But it proves the point that if you crush the economy,
right,
it's a hydrocarbon-based economy. If you crush it, you will use less hydrocarbon. There'll be fewer emissions. And they went right back up, in fact, made up for lost ground, because again, last year, 2022, we added something like, I didn't get the numbers wrong, 30 gigatons of carbon to the atmosphere, which was more than ever before. And this year will be more than once again. So you're on this path in spite of the pandemic proof point that, yep, it's the economy, stupid.
Yeah, well, that scares a lot of people, and so they don't want that. But, let me ask you a question. You can test my premise, but back to crushing the economy. I'm arguing based on, World Economic Forum data and other data that the value of natural ecosystem services into the economy is not seen and is not recognized. Consequently, it's like a hidden subsidy, and that actually, if you were going to value that, you'd be our economy would already be on its knees. It's just not showing up in market valuation. And if it started to, we'd be looking at, prioritization perhaps differently, or, our priorities might shift. And I don't know how to get at that unless the capital markets and the sort of financial departments and the departments of treasury, and this is going on, the accounting system shift, the satellite accounts become not satellite, but integrated and start to affect credit ratings, that you begin to situate the state of the economy more clearly and recognize the unpaid work of nature, because it is a hidden subsidy. And, I don't know if you remember this, but it's in the book where Puma did an environmental P&L. And, they reported their earnings as 202 euros that year, except the environmental P&L looked at the negative impacts. If they had to pay for the water, they used at a higher rate, if they had to pay a carbon price, if they had to pay real property values for using the land that the cows were grazing on, but they only buy the leather, they don't own the land, et cetera, 145 euros of cost out of the 202 euros earned that year. So significant drop in revenue. And that could be the case of a lot of companies. And if all companies that would be a big change, Alan. If all companies were strongly recommended, if not required.
But by whom? But that I go back to agency. Who's going to make this change?
Shareholders, one, could do it. The SEC could do it. They're coming up with a climate disclosure rule. Maybe they should require or strongly recommend an environmental P&L. Insurance companies, look at the insurance sector, is running away from the highest risk. Why don't they tie D&O insurance to an environmental P&L? That would be a step forward.
Because that's not their business. Their business is to make money. It's an excellent point, because what they're doing is withdrawing from those places, California, Florida, for example, which are highly exposed to climate change, saying those risks are not insurable. Now, in the long run, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, that means people won't own houses in California or Florida.
Exactly.
We have 40 years, or do we have 4 years?
Well, the science tells us that we don't have 40 years. I go back to your original question is, why aren't we doing anything? It's partly because it's easier to kick the can, because the due date seems to keep being 2040, 2050. But you know very well from your experience, whatever your job is, and especially if you're a leader, you have a limited time when you have you can use your maximum authority, your maximum imagination, your tenure to achieve something, your agency is at a peak only for a couple of years. So, I think part of the doability issue is people in authority, whatever that authority role is, what can I do in 5 years? What can I actually do in 5 years? Can I get 5 years worth of reduction? Can I get 5 years worth of expanded forest resilient bond? Can I get 5 years of anything that matters? And then I could get 5 more and 5 more. But if everything is on a 20 or 40 year horizon, it's just too easy not to do anything. And, the D&O, the insurance, it may not be their business because they're in money to make money. But as you said, they won't be able to make money if they have to get out of every market. And then where does that cost land? I mean, this back to these silly little analogies, but the bouncing ball, follow the bouncing ball when you sing. Well, the cost of these disasters is like a bouncing ball bouncing around the economy. It's not hitting the real economy yet, but it's hitting the people whose houses are burned out and can't get a new one because there's no insurance. It's hitting FEMA, which is you and me through our taxpayer, because FEMA is constantly having to shell out. And it's hitting, the insurance companies who can't seem to continue insuring, certainly reinsurance. And so, when do those costs actually hit the real economy? And I would argue that they're hitting it. We just don't see it. And we're going to see it possibly in some kind of an environmental default where you have, what if all of Canada's forests went on fire tomorrow? They practically already are. What about smoke in America? If leaving aside the forest fires themselves, everything would stop. Again, it'd be like COVID.
I want to push on that just one more time. U.S. environmental policy is almost an oxymoron relative to the problem. China equally badly. Those are the two superpowers. Arguably, the Europeans have done the most in terms of all sorts of different approaches to this issue, including the largest, most significant effort to price carbon, and most recently to impose a border tax that if you are producing something with more carbon, you're going to have to pay a tax to get it into Europe. That's good. That's leadership. You could make a case, though, that Europe doesn't grow anymore, partially perhaps as a consequence. In 2008, the American economy was smaller than the European economy. In 2023, the United States economy is 3 times bigger than the European economy. They don't grow anymore, and that is partially a conscious set of choices about consuming carbon. How do we get other people to say, yep, we're going to trade off that growth because it's killing the planet? The Europeans did. The Americans haven't. The Chinese haven't. The Indians refuse. The Brazilians say absolutely positively not. And we're headed in this direction of the lack of leadership. And I go back, you said it a couple of times, it really does seem like it comes finally to the L word, which in this case is leadership.
Yeah, well, leadership, nothing without leadership. But, to your point, and this is radical, but, I would say, first of all, it's a privilege to renounce growth. And I'm not so sure that you renounce it necessarily. There's other forms of growth, but even allowing for that, I argue in the book, for example, take the Congo. These are very poor countries. They're sitting on the last remaining rainforest that's actually a net sequestrator. They're sitting on tons of peat that hold thousands of years worth of carbon that sits on top of oil. And the world is asking them to renounce that oil and renounce cutting the trees, renounce releasing the peat. The Prime Minister of Ecuador, President of Ecuador, proposed something 20 years ago, which he called the Yasuni bond, which would have been the same thing. Would pay us not to develop the oil, not to take it out of the ground. And that was very well received, but the money to pay the Ecuadorians never materialized. The government was corrupt. It didn't work. But there may be room for that idea again, because why would the Congo, even if it's a sterling example of efficient government, even under those circumstances, which it isn't, maybe it's time to say that we have to compensate those countries that have sequestration potential for the, quote, renunciation of growth, namely the burning of the fossil fuel. Because I don't see any other way to avoid their taking. We've seen that we've done that experiment too. Oil producing countries produce oil. There's no example where they don't. Norway produces it, gives, takes with one hand, gives with the other. But at least Norway uses its money and has, you could argue, moving itself away from fossil fuels while enabling everybody else to use fossil fuels. Big contradiction. You probably saw the Times yesterday, the article about the Ford Motor Company, where Ford is going hat in hand for a collaboration with China to help learn literally how to make a certain kind of battery, which Ford doesn't seem to have the expertise to do on its own. So China being autocratic, but they've made huge investments in these technologies and their next generation, story I like to tell, and I tell it in the book. When I started the Tianjin Climate Exchange in China with Richard Sandor and PetroChina, there was nobody who outside of the high elite intellectual research council for the Communist Party, carbon markets were not known. Today, there's hundreds of people who've been trained in them, and they're ready to launch the world's biggest carbon market. So, there's ways of growing your economy, training your people that are sort of resting on the, quote, green economy. You don't have to give up everything, but the compensation to the countries that are poor but still rich in biodiversity and carbon sequestration potential, we've got to transfer money to them. And I would even argue that they are the creditor countries, and we're the debtor countries in terms of that. The transfer of value from them to us is huge.
Let's leave it there. It is an optimistic note. You are looking for solutions, and we need solutions. And I want to encourage people to get the book, Pricing the Priceless, The Financial Transformation to Value the Planet, Solve the Climate Crisis, and Protect Our Most Precious Asset by Paula DiPerna. Thank you, Paula, for the conversation and for the book.
Thank you so much, Alan. Always a pleasure. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of New Thinking for a New World. I'm Alan Stoga, podcast host, and I look forward to your joining our next conversation. Remember, tell us what you think at telbergfoundation.org.